Good to see you again. Ylva is the Process Safety and Compliance Manager for Wesfarmers Chemicals and Energy and Fertilisers. WesCEF operates several major hazard facilities around the place and produce ammonia, ammonium nitrate, sodium cyanide, fertiliser, LPG and LNG. Ylva's worked in engineering, maintenance, production roles across a range of industries, including oil refining, alumina, nickel, and chemicals manufacturers, and now has the distinct pleasure of putting up with my MHF team and myself. So yes, welcome, Ylva. Thank you very much.
Right. Okay. So you would have noticed in that lovely introduction that there was nothing about Ylva as a human factors expert. So unlike all of those lovely people who've talked to you before me, I am far more operationally inclined rather than human factors experienced. So the presentation I'm going to give to you and what I'm going to share with you is we're going to go from that big picture of human factors and what could you do and how could you use it to a very small lens of this is one application of one human factors tool. What are the benefits of it and how do we do it? So what I'll do first is I'll talk a little bit about WesCEF because most people have never heard of WesCEF and I feel like I need to not sell it to you, but maybe establish some credibility that we actually run some production plants and have some similarities to the plants many of you run. And then I will go through a series of slides that explain that great big mouthful of the presentation title. So now the order of the slides, I haven't glossed it up to say after we did all this is the perfect way to do it and let's sell the glossed up version. I'm going to essentially talk you through the story of what did we do and what did we work out along the way. So human error, reliability, prediction, analysis.
That's the button.
I know that's the button. I'm still not ready to start going through slides. I like to talk. Obviously, I'm not going to use that mouthful very often. It's got this very convenient little acronym called SHERPA, which isn't particularly resonating with anyone on operations floor either. But going through that whole mouthful is pretty much what we're going to do. So thanks, Steve. I will. All right. So, yep. All right. So we're going to talk about what it is. So clearly it's systematic, which to translate means there's an Excel spreadsheet involved, some sort of tabular structure. You're actually going through everything step by step. It does look, sorry, it does look at human error. So you're trying to determine systematically where can a human error or oversight occur. And you're looking at, when it says reliability and prediction analysis, you're really looking, so if we think back to risk management, if there's a risk of a human oversight or error, what are the safeguards? What are the things you can do? What are the controls that maybe you do or don't have to help them? So we'll go through what it is, what it's good for, because like most things, it's not good for everything. And a bit of a practical, well, how do you do it? Like, do you have to get a consultant in? Is it really tricky? And then I'm going to run through some examples from the plants where we've used it. Oh, okay. All right. So I think maybe I got excited about going forward. I've lost a slide. Anyway, so just to go back to the credibility of who WesCEF is. So as Steve explained, we're basically a chemicals manufacturer and a gas processor. So the two brand companies, I guess, that maybe you might have heard of are Clean Heat and CSBP. Most people have heard of them, if not WesCEF. So we make ammonia, we make ammonium nitrate, we make LNG, LPG, sodium cyanide. They're the major chemicals that we produce. So all of our manufacturing plants are based in Perth. And in terms of the size of WesCEF, most of our production plants have between maybe 60 to 150 operators. That's the size of the facilities. Yes, we have roughly 1,300 people. We don't have a human factors advisor or expert or lead human factors person. So in that sense, I'm sure there's lots of other operators in this room going, yeah, we don't either. You know, like we're trying to do what we can with human factors. We want to be better, but we're doing it ourselves and trying to get smarter along the way. All right, so SHERPA, systematic human error analysis. in most fields, so whether it's human factors or reliability or process optimization, one really convenient way to think of them is as a toolkit, right? So there's a range of tools or methods, and you want to find the right tool for the right job typically. Despite the popularity of Leathermans, there's usually one application that's going to work best. So I'm not going to talk about the big human factors and why it matters. I'm going to talk about one of the tools in the toolkit of human factors, and that's what SHERPA can be thought of. Okay, so I'm going to try very hard not to talk this up and to make it sound pretty practical. So fundamentally, there's a few steps, and the first step is once you've identified what you'd like to look at, so an operational procedure, you want to review it. So we'll just diverge for a little bit and we'll talk about why did we decide to do this? It wasn't because we went to a human factors forum and went, hey, we should do more with human factors. For us, it was because we actually had an incident. We had a loss of containment, we had a release of ammonia. So for us, we import ammonia from ship to shore as well as manufacture it. And we had an incident where we had a premature release of the loading arm off the ship's manifold, and an ammonia release resulted from that. Now, the good news was that we didn't seriously harm anybody. We certainly scared the two operators who were on the jetty at the time a lot because there was a cloud of ammonia released, and it was a bit of a wake-up call for us as a company. Everyone tends to rely on lived experience. You know, no matter how many HAZOPs and risk assessments you do, there's still that gut feeling of, we've been here a long time, what have we seen, we know our plant. So this was a bit of a wake-up for us. This was a process that we thought was really well managed, well understood. So some of the causes, and I'm not here to present on that incident, but some of the causes were very human related. So the loading arm had a nice green light that said fully engaged, ready to commence. And everyone had assumed that green light was activated by a limit switch or something, but it wasn't. It was just a green light that said you'd finished all the previous steps. It didn't say you'd definitely connected. There was a very experienced operator who thought he was opening a valve but was actually closing it. And I guess we avoided that pitfall of blaming an individual because he was a 20 years experience, the sort of person you go to ask for help to diagnose things. So those sorts of things made us go, well, aside from the engineering redesign and looking at limit switches and all those lovely engineered controls, we have a dependence on administrative or human controls. And that often happens with loading and unloading of dangerous goods. You've got some instrumentation, but you've still got a truck driver observing, you've still got a lead operator managing the process. So we went, well, we really should do something. Like, there's all these procedures that we thought were really good, but we've still had things go wrong. And we didn't actually know what was a good approach to use. And I've never met Zoe before, and I swear that I'm not being paid for this, but we actually had previously used HF integration for some alarm management work. So I rang them and went, well, this is what we're trying to work out. We've got all these procedures. Is there anything like practical hands-on that we can do to work through these things and look at what's going wrong? So that was the consultant we brought in to help us to start with. All right, so that's where we got to. So the first step is we needed to review the procedure with the right roles. So typically the right roles are, you really want two operators who are experienced on the job. They don't have to both be experts. It's good to have one person who's highly competent. The other might be more recently trained and competent. You want a supervisor or someone who's responsible for that area. If you do the review and find that there's improvements that need to be made, ideally you want someone in your little group that's going to go, oh yeah, I completely understand why we need to implement an additional float or an additional dial indication or a backup system. Okay, so a process trainer, you could probably think of that as who owns your procedure. So it might be, you might have a job role that's called a process trainer. You might have someone that focuses on your training procedures for operations. Whoever that person is that owns that procedure is quite useful to have involved. One proviso. If you're doing this after an incident, they won't say it this bluntly, but you'll detect it in the room. They own that procedure. They're usually the person who's highly competent or has mastery, and there's going to be an element of Yeah, but if I'd been doing it, it would have been fine. The procedure's fine. It's actually those people that made the mistake. They're not competent. So one very good tip for managing that sort of dialogue is to introduce the terms of, rather than saying competent and incompetent, acknowledge that some people have mastery. That gives the person that owns the procedure a bit of recognition that they're the expert, and then everyone else is either competent or moving towards competency. And just try and avoid the word incompetent, then you kind of be in the pitfall of blame all over again. The process engineer, you don't always have to have them. If you're doing something that's in the middle of your plant and it's highly complex and you need an engineer, grab them. If you're focusing on loading trucks and it's not really engineering related, then they're the opt-out option there. All right, the next bit, you're going to need some sort of spreadsheet tool if you've got a reasonably big procedure. What you're going to do with this group of people is you're going to talk through and work out what are the critical steps and then what are the safeguards. So critical is a great word. Most of you would have had the experience of using the term safety critical and realising that everyone's talking about safety critical, but they actually see it in different ways. In this sense, the critical steps, we're talking about dangerous goods, process safety, risk here. The critical steps are the steps where if you make a mistake or forget to do something, you're going to have a release of a dangerous good, or you're going to harm somebody or have a hand entrapped. It's very much safety focused. If you are working in quality or process optimization or sales, your view of what's critical will be a bit different. So make sure you define what's critical. You're not doing this as to supplement Six Sigma and be a quality expert. And then finally, you need to go and observe the activity. And we might move on. I'll talk more about observing in a minute. Okay, so with the procedures, I suspect most of you have procedures a bit similar to ours. They're pages and pages long. They're often developed for training and competency assessment for new people coming on board. You could have 60 or 80 separate steps or more in a procedure. This is where this process gets a bit time consuming. You actually have to talk through each step, each individual step of your procedure with the operators and talk about, okay, what do? You know, you check the connection. Okay, how do you know that it's actually connected? If it's not really connected, what could happen? What are the consequences? Could something fall down? Could you have a release? Okay, if there's a limit switch and you get an indication, so that's a safeguard. Who sees a safeguard? Do you, or does it go somewhere else? So that's the kind of thing you're looking at step by step. So that gives you your critical steps, or so that's the critical, I think they're called critical tasks in this presentation, or the critical steps of your procedure. Okay, so once you've done that and you've gone, okay, we've looked at all the things that can go wrong, and it's starting to become pretty clear that we might have a handful or two in this whole procedure where if something doesn't go according to plan with the human involved, something bad could happen. Then you want to have a little bit of a look at, well, why? Why could it go wrong? When it talks about job design, it's really talking about, well, how's the equipment designed? You know, they're supposed to be monitoring a gauge, but it's actually on the other side of the pump and behind the pipe rack support, and it's no direct line of sight, you know, and nobody's actually going to be running around trying to see it. That's a job design fault. Individual factors, you have to try and think about, you're not dealing with your highest common denominator, the perfect operator, the person you go and ask for help with troubleshooting. You're talking about the person who, they're pretty good, they're competent, but they're a bit tired, or they've got something on their mind. Everybody varies from day to day. You need to be thinking through the lens of the person that's struggling the most and going to have the most issues. And organisational factors, that's got to do with things like, what's your minimum manning levels on the shift? Have you got enough people to do this task, etc. All right, and then finally, it's safeguards. So what are your existing safeguards? You may very well find that some steps don't have safeguards. They are dependent on the human doing exactly what they're supposed to in exactly that way. And if there's any shortcoming, then you're going to get the consequence. So are all the failure factors addressed by the safeguard? And then can we do more? So that's pretty straightforward. I'm glad I introduced this by saying this is a very applied hands-on approach. This is not rocket science. You don't need to go and study human factors or be as smart as the other people who've presented to us today. All right, so this is, and I'm sorry for the people at the back of the room, even when I put this in, I went, most of you won't be able to see it, but it's just easier sometimes to go, this is what it looks like. So up the top, you can see in that lovely red alert writing what the columns are. So what can go wrong? What behaviour are we trying to avoid? So you're looking at each task is a step in the procedure. What's the possible human shortcoming? This is a pretty innocuous example. This is about missing steps in a process. So no matter what process you're doing with humans, you might have a checklist, or whether or not you've got a checklist, you're still relying on them. They can skip a step, whether they don't see the value of it and they want to shortcut it, or because they had one of those what colour traffic light did I just drive through moment and lose track of where they were. Why might the failure occur? Is it poorly designed? Are there any factors? So this is talking because it's a checklist and the process isn't followed correctly. What if people don't see the value of checklists? What if you've got a culture of tick and flick, which I believe everybody has some element of that still in their cultures. Tendency to just run through the checklist without really thinking through what you need to do. So risk complacency, and then looking at, can you improve the measures? So this particular example led to, or can you make your checklist better? All right. So before we talk about field observation, I guess it would be useful to know, well, how long does it take to do this? You know, this process of going step by step through the procedure sounds as exciting as, can you come and do 8 weeks of HAZOP non-stop all day, every day, doesn't it? Typically, so with the ammonia import, we had 5 procedures and they were each roughly 20 pages long. So I do remember the morning of the workshop waking up and going, we have got 100 pages of procedure and I don't know why we thought this was a good idea. It took about 6 hours. That was pretty grueling, okay? So it's not, but you're not often going to want to do this for 6 procedures. There were 6 procedures here because they were very definite, prepare the system, then connect the manifold, then do the import, then disconnect, so there were these different phases. If you're just looking at one procedure, you might be looking at maybe 2 hours or so of discussing with a group. You don't want to be discussing in the field. You want to be discussing either in a meeting room or the crib room. It doesn't really matter where you go, but you don't want to be out in the field where people will naturally want to go, yeah, let's stop talking about it, let me go and show you, because then you're going to kind of go off track all over the place. All right, so the observation bit. So I'm going to digress from engineering a bit. In anthropology, so when you're actually observing, like, let's take it to the extreme, you're in the Amazon or whatever, you're observing a society and a culture that haven't really interacted with other people previously. So in anthropology, I forget what the term is, but they talk about, well, even just the just being present is going to change how people behave, right? So if they can even see you, even if you're up the top of the tree, they can't interact with you. Just knowing that you're being observed changes how you behave, right? So you don't want to have any more than 2 observers. You want it to be really, really clear. You're going to have to say it numerous times that you're not there to audit. So if you've got people in your process safety or safety teams who've got strong audit backgrounds as well, and that's pretty common, you're really going to have to emphasise this, because you're not there to audit, because auditing is, are they doing each step? And if they don't do a step, that's a bad thing. You are observing to see, okay, in particular with the critical steps, what are they actually doing? Can they see the safeguard that they said they were relying on? You're trying to observe and be as unobtrusive as possible. You can't remove yourself completely, but it's different from auditing. All right, you want to minimise the interaction. So unless you see something where you're like, oh my God, they're going to hurt themselves, or this is a bit mind-boggling, but we seem to have gone off into doing something that isn't even referred to in the procedure, and it's been 3 steps and we're off doing God only knows what. Unless it's like that, you want to save your questions and your discussions until later, until the end if possible. You're trying to see what they do without you being there. Okay. Doesn't really matter whether you use the same or different operators that you used when you discuss the procedure. So sometimes it depends on the task. If it's a task where it happens pretty much every day, it's easy to organise with shift patterns. If you're trying to observe a startup or a import or dispatch activity, you're going to have problems with scheduling, would be my guess, because I certainly did. So you really want to have a connection through a supervisor or someone so that everybody's going, it's okay, this is not like being audited. This is not about me, the individual, and my performance. This is about understanding that activity. All right, so is this worth doing? Well, our experience is, and I'll go through some specific examples, is that it does produce really useful results. So it's straightforward. It's not rocket science. There is no number crunching, no order of magnitude or whatever. It is time consuming. You have to be genuinely interested and enjoy talking to operational people, right? It's not suitable for every procedure. Okay, so we initially did it on the ammonia import. And interestingly enough, the group that got really excited about how wonderful this was and wanted it to be done to everything was actually what we referred to as our board. So not so much the businesses, but the general managers. So the level of people who are sitting on a board with director responsibilities, looking after commercial and production, because they were like, oh, if we do this for everything, that will ensure we don't have like risks of major incidents from humans making mistakes. So one of my learnings the hard way on this was you do need to define very clearly what you're going to use it for and what it's suitable for, because it is definitely not suitable for every procedure. You will never have the time to do it and it won't add value in that sense. Okay, so like I said, if you were going to gloss this, if I glossed this up, I probably would have started off with this is the sorts of things it's useful for, but we were doing this like lots of operators. We're trying something new, we're getting some value out of it, and now we're working it out. So we had a process safety definition of critical procedures. So that's very much focused on risk. So the potential for deviation to result in a major incident. So that's terminology all of you will be familiar with. And practically, when we looked at like deviation from a human point of view, one of the highest risks for us was loading and unloading activities. So typically these have got some degree of instrumentation, but they're just not possible to fully automate it, go through a load per analysis, have your risk reduction to whatever it might be, 10 to the minus 4, 10 to the minus 5 or whatever. You've got some instrumentation and then a high reliance on humans. These are the sorts of major incident scenarios that are going to sit at your HAZOP level, not go through to number crunching world. So that is where this is most useful, is our observation. The next one is start up and shut down of process plants. So this is where you've got humans, lovely humans, the people we value most until something goes wrong, and then we tend to go, well, what did you do wrong? So start up and shut down, intermittent. Someone might, based on whatever panel structure you're running, they might not get to start up a particular plant more than once a decade, or that particular part of the startup. Okay, so where you've got a safety barrier where there's an operator response. Now, we do not do this for all like LOPA safety barriers. There are other human factors tools that we use with that sort of thing, but it is at times quite useful, and we don't use it for mitigating responses. Okay, so we did it on the ammonia incident, so that sort of thing, and then courtesy of our human factors champions on the board, it was, well, we need to go and do it on some of our other facilities. So we focused on loading and unloading. And I'm going to talk through some of the specifics. So in our sodium cyanide plant, we load isotainers on rail cars with sodium cyanide liquid solution, and they go from Kwinana off to the goldfields. So no surprises there. And that's essentially what it looks like. So there's a useful picture of a train from our corporate affairs people. Now, we didn't use a consultant for this. So we used a consultant the first time, and then we went, well, I think we can do this for the next ones ourselves, provided we use people that were working with the consultant in the first place. So we used the first consultant workshop essentially as a training workshop as well as actually doing the activity. in this instance, we had a 22-page procedure with a 3-page checklist and 37 steps. And as is often the case, when I went to the business to go, look, we really need to look at this, everyone was at pains to assure me that it was a really good quality procedure. It had been reviewed within the 2 years determined by document control. Everything was awesome. And that's usually the case. Nobody's out there believing that their key procedures are rubbish. So you're always going to get this, sure, if you really want to, we're happy to help you, but it's pretty good. It was a good quality procedure. It had been regularly reviewed. It had warnings and alerts in it, and it had plenty of photos. So if you flick through it, you'd be like, well, that's pretty good. Okay, so this one, I led the process. So I didn't have a human factors expert with me. And I did it in a crib room. So this is one where the trains come in at different times of day, and I needed the 2 operators and the supervisor, and I was basically dependent on timing, which meant that we ended up in the crib room. And that means I certainly didn't use a spreadsheet. I used the handprint, the hard copy of the procedure and scribbled along on it. So you don't have to be, you don't have to have a scribe, you don't have to be super formal, you can be very practical. It took us about 2.5 hours. I remember we had to be finished before morning tea and the crib room getting occupied. So this one was a good discussion. It went for about 2 hours. We went through all the steps, and then after lunch, the trains were coming in and we did the observation. So in this case, we did it all on the same day. To summarise the outcomes, we didn't identify potential for major incident, which is good. I would suggest that in most cases, you're not going to, right? You've done enough work on your risk assessments, unless you're a startup or you've got a relatively new facility. Now, there were a total of 7 critical steps. So out of the 37, 7 of them are critical. One of the critical steps was a little note in italics underneath a step, which looked very much like, this is a good thing to be aware of, but no biggie. We had 2 of those critical steps that didn't have any safeguard, and I'll talk through what they were. And the highest risk step was actually no longer needed. So let's talk about that one, because that was a pretty good outcome. So this process actually required the operators to dip with a long piece of tube the rail car to confirm it was empty before they started filling. And then after they'd filled it, they had to dip it again to confirm that it was at the level. Now, there've been a lot of automation upgrades and process control upgrades in this system over the preceding 5 years or so. So when we reviewed the procedure in the crib room, it was all like, oh yeah, okay, that's what you do. And then when we got out there and they were like, and I do this and all the control panel, all the rest of it, one of the questions was, why do you need to dip it? This is the closest you come to physically contacting sodium cyanide. So doesn't the control panel give you this number? And then the story was, well, years ago, like 5 or so years ago, there was a train that got to Cal and there was an empty isotainer. So someone had one of those, I'm shunting it along one by one and I've lost track of where I'm at. So let's focus on the positives. They clearly didn't blame the individual, because they then implemented this, well, we're going to get everyone to dip every single rail car. They then did instrumentation upgrades, and as often happens with MOC and engineering change, well done, but the operating procedure, that connection just didn't quite make it. They upgraded some of it, but missed that. Like, it's easy to add more to a procedure. It's hard to actually recognise, you know what, we don't need to do this anymore. So probably the best outcome of doing this, which is not what I expected, was we removed those steps and they don't have to open the connection to the contents and they don't have to dip it. That's the kind of good win that you want. So then the operators were like, oh, okay, this whole process is worthwhile. You've actually just saved us rigging up in PPE and doing something we didn't like doing. Okay, so my last bit that I'll share with you is subsequent to this, I did observe the startup. With a startup, it is a little bit harder. You will never get the whole shift that are going to do the startup, because things change, the scheduled time, you shut down the schedule, whatever, it's going to move. Reviewed the procedure with the process engineer and then sat in the shift with for the night. Now, so my key learning there was, if you, and I suspect you're all doing this just like we are, every startup you're trying to improve your automation or your semi-automation of what your DCS is doing. So you're working through steps where it says, open this valve, you can't proceed to the next step of starting the pump until the limit switch is engaged to confirm the valve's fully opened. That's the sort of processes we had in place in the sodium cyanide plant when I observed the startup. You won't get any value out of this process if that's what you're trying to audit, because in that sense, your checklist is essentially you're monitoring progress through something where they're inbuilt into your control system to determine what can happen in what sequence. It is useful where you've got a startup and you've got field activities. So we're doing a startup, this much is automated, then we've got to go out and do manual activities in the field, or we've got to do a manual preheat of something. So yes, that's my only learning I can share with you before you get too excited about, because it was a very long night shift for me observing that, and that was my key outcome as long. All right, so finally, getting to the end. Okay, so you're not going to do it to every procedure. You've identified critical steps. You've improved maybe some of your safeguards and got rid of some superfluous stuff. Well, how do you actually capture the critical steps? And this is where you meet the joy that is document control and procedure templates and checklist templates. And I can't tell you that we've got the perfect outcome here. So these are you'll be familiar with these sorts of warning and alerts, and I think you'll also be familiar with them being in your procedures for all sorts of things, from an alert that the site maximum speed limit is 15k an hour, or don't walk behind the forklift, or make sure you optimise the blend because it's quality critical. So there are alerts and warnings all through procedures for a multitude of things, and how you get something that is it's not just safety critical. Remember, everyone thinks safety critical is a bit different depending on their job role and their perspective. You're trying to flag, if you don't do this, you could have something go horribly wrong. So we did modify our procedure templates to have a specific type of warning and alert. My reservation here is we've got hundreds, if not thousands, of procedures, and this process is applied only to a very small number of them. So I'm not sure what the solution is, but that is something that you would have to work through. Now, okay, so let's talk about checklists a little bit. So not everyone in my own organisation agrees with me, but to me, the procedures are really important for when you're bringing in new people, if you've got high turnover rates, if you're trying to get people trained and competent. But in my working life, I am yet to see any operator in the field doing anything with the procedure even rolled up in their back pocket, let alone in their hand. So when it comes to trying to manage, let's not make a mistake or an omission on the job, I think checklists are much more value adding than the procedure. The procedures for your onboarders. So we did this process, and one of the things the consultant kept saying to me was, you'll need to improve your checklist, you'll need to improve your checklist. And I was like, obviously this is not that hard, but our checklists at the moment are basically a numbered sequence with 1 or 2 sentences and a box next to it to tick. That was the state of our checklists. And I'm not a checklist visual design expert. So I got to the point where I went, I understand this is probably not overly complicated, but could you please show me what you mean by a really good checklist that helps manage human error? So this is what we were given. It's quite different from black and white numbers and boxes. So the key things here are, 1, they significantly reduce the number of things in the checklist. So the stuff like move the hose from behind the pipe rack to where you're going to connect, where obviously if you don't do that, you can't do anything else anyway. So why do you need to put in the checklist? Basically drop all that stuff out. You don't want to be using the checklist to summarise your procedure. This is the stuff that you actually need to remind and consciously do. So the amount that was in the checklist reduced. The critical steps, in terms of if you don't do it or you make a mistake, will have a critical impact, are in red. They colour blocked by roles. So where you've got different operators doing different things. If you've got a 1-person activity, that's great, but not much is these days. And you'll see over on the right where it talks about check, there's very little that is a check as in tick. They've asked for specific values wherever possible. What's the distance? Is it done? What was the pressure? You're writing down something. You're actually going, is that right? And yes or no, or open or closed. So as I predicted, this also is not rocket science, but if you're used to, it's all just like a series of boxes that you tick. This is actually, what is it? This is hard to imagine until someone shows it to you, and then it's as obvious as anything. Now, again, the problem that we struggle with here is if you're only doing this process to a small number of your checklists and you're only going to have critical steps on a relatively small number, then it's going to be very hard from a cultural behavioural point of view to get everyone to remember what that is and whether it matters to them. And that is something that I think will be an ongoing challenge. It certainly is for us at the moment. But yeah, so, okay. So in summary, it ended up being called critical task observations because things like SHERPA and systematic human error reliability prediction analysis don't kind of resonate with people, particularly in crib rooms. So a critical task observation, so remember, it's not an audit, it's an observation. You're focusing on what needs to be done, not on what the individual person's competency is. It's pretty easy. It is systematic and it's definitely people oriented. So I appreciate that in my presentation it looks like documents and spreadsheets, but you're going to spend most of your time talking to people and observing people. So if you're working in safety, but you like nothing better than getting out into the plant and looking at what's really happening, this should be something that you're more than happy to do. And thank you very much for your time and for listening.
Thanks, Ylva. That was cool. Just as a follow-on, that incident that WSF had with their disconnect, I just want to give the audience an idea of what actually, what we did about that. It was one of those classic learnings from our point of view about here is a process that should be well controlled, everybody knows what they're doing. As Ylva said, the people involved, all that sort of stuff, and it surprised us. Our response wasn't a regulatory impact to Ylva. Yes, we want to know exactly what went on and all that sort of stuff. But our response was actually much different. Our response was actually trying to identify around Australia all the others that were like that and getting in contact with them and trying to prevent that accident or that incident happening somewhere else. And what we found was that the same problems that Ylva just described was part of the way that it was put forward and part of the way that a lot of other facilities around Australia were actually done. And so we were able to actually get that changes that they identified made elsewhere, and so saved other people before it actually happened. So, I can only encourage it. Often the perception is not to talk to the regulator, but part of our role is actually preventing and passing on information that happens to others and letting others know so it doesn't happen to them. I am far more interested in actually working with you, trying to understand a problem than suddenly walking along and finding it and finding out that there's been a problem and you haven't talked to me about it.